Naomi. Thank you. This afternoon we have Naomi Milthorpe from University of Tasmania speaking on From Accession to Black Mischief, the Politics of Race in Evelyn Waugh's satire. I think, we're all familiar as humour studies scholars with the trope of the successful comic who is deep down a very, very unhappy individual, the kind of sad clown trope. But perhaps less familiar with the successful comic novelist who deep down is a complete and utter shit. But I'm sure Naomi will have more to say about that. Please welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I just want to thank the organisers of this wonderful conference. I've had such a wonderful time so far. The papers have been fantastic, and I'm really eager to continue conversations that we've been having so far. I also would like to acknowledge that we meet today on Milnita country, to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Palawa people, the traditional owners and custodians of these lands, and to acknowledge that this is land that was never ceded. This paper makes reference, in case you haven't already guessed it, to language and representations which, because they are racially demeaning and abusive, are likely to offend many audience members. If you wish not to take part in this conversation, I respect that, and I do not at all. I will not take offence if you wish to leave at any point. I do not endorse such language or representations, but I will make reference to them in as limited fashion as I can in order to unpack their relation to racist humour. Why does one laugh at a Negro? This is Henri Bergson wondering in his essay on laughter, before turning for his answer to the proverbial man in the street. The question would appear to be an embarrassing one. Yet I rather fancy the correct answer was suggested to me one day in the street by an ordinary cabbie who applied the expression unwashed to the Negro fare he was driving. Unwashed. Does not this mean that a black face in our imagination is one daubed over with ink or soot? And so we see that the notion of disguise has passed on something of its comic quality to instances in which there is actually no disguise, though there might be. So Bergson, as we are all aware, is foundational to critical theory on humour and comedy. And yet this passage, one of his key examples of what we count as funny, is really dwelt upon by scholars of humour. Why not? Is it because, like Bergson says of his own question, it's an embarrassing one? Is it because we can't bear to face up to the racism at the heart of our theory? Bergson's vision of the comic Negro draws on popular stereotypes of blackface minstrelsy, which, as Mark William Westmoreland notes, assumes whiteness as a transcendental norm. In this ideology, the black face is a blacked up face, one which illustrates, as Westmoreland continues, norms regarding, quote, inclusion and exclusion, norms of who counts as a human person and who counts as deficient, end quote. Donna V. Jones writes, Bergson says that, quote, we laugh at blacks for the same reason we laugh at clowns. The joke seems to be not only that the person is simply wearing the clown suit of black skin, but that he cannot take it off and regain the suppleness and freedom of the underlying active white subject. Black people are for Bergson tragic comedy, end quote. So I started with Bergson and not Waugh, because I think that thinking about these norms about who counts as we in a community of laughers is crucial for understanding the ways in which satire mobilises the political category of race. We've already begun these conversations today and yesterday, and I want to acknowledge the people who have already spoken about this. Satire, as we know, is interested in norms, in standards, values, customs, rules, either in disturbing them or maintaining them. And as we also know, satire usually disturbs and maintains those norms through acts of verbal or imagined violence. In white conservative or reactionary satire, this is the satire that concerns me in my research, the norms that are cherished and protected frequently overlap, I would like to argue, with norms around categories of identity, such as sexuality, gender, religion, or race. And this is the politics that I'm talking about today, rather than political, party political politics. So to think through the aesthetics, the affects, and the politics of satire as it relates to race, I'm going to look closely at the 1932 satire of Empire, Black Mischief, by the English Catholic reactionary satirist Evelyn Waugh. I chose this example because I am at work on a project to produce a scholarly edition of this novel. I'm reasonably familiar with Waugh's body of work as a satirist, but also because of the peculiar aptness of his fiction for prompting questions about inclusion and expulsion. This paper is in 4 parts, exploring racist satire theoretically as well as through the practical example of Waugh's fiction and his material book, particularly his illustrations. I want to take seriously the claims of satire's efficacy. How does satire disfigure its victims? And does it hurt? How does Waugh's novel disfigure its satiric objects? I hope to show that Waugh affects visual disfigurement via racialized caricature on the page and through the trope of eating and being eaten, which is part of the wider satiric trope in the novel of cannibalism. So Black Mischief, how many of you are familiar with this novel? Okay, I'm gonna do this. It's not a hugely familiar novel. I'm gonna do a little précis of the plot so that we're all on the same page, figuratively speaking. So Black Mischief sees the London bounder, Basil Seal, travelling to a fictional African island, Azania, to witness the crowning of its youthful Oxford-educated emperor, Seth, following a period of civil war. Seth is eager to modernise his nation and he seeks a bastion of, quote, progress in the new age. And progress in the new age is repeated throughout the novel. It's kind of Seth's catchphrase. And he finds Basil, who is a kind of louche, irresponsible man about town, and clearly the embodiment of white Western modernity for Waugh. Basil becomes a de facto governor of Azania, with all governmental decisions referred through his newly created Ministry of Modernisation. Quite clearly, well, maybe not quite clearly, but I do want to state the novel is extremely scornful of modernity and scornful of the modern West, and particularly the modern West's ideals of internationalism, democracy, and cultural plurality, underscored by technocratic innovation. Waugh was a real reactionary. In emulating the imperial West, Waugh argues Seth's utopian project is doomed to fail. At the same time, a subplot, which is important to my paper, is that Basil meets Prudence Courtney, who is the daughter of the envoy of the British legation, and he begins a sexual relationship with her. In the denouement of the novel, a coup is mounted against Seth. The country descends into a round of civil war. Seth is deposed and killed, and in the kind of final scenes, there's a funeral feast for Seth in which Prudence, having crashed her airplane in the midst of cannibal territory, is cooked and eaten in a stew which Basil eats. It's this like culmination of the Heart of Darkness. In his 1962 preface to the 3rd UK edition of the novel, Waugh identified its primary theme as the conflict of civilization with all its attendant and deplorable ills and barbarism. But before he called his novel Black Mischief, he called it Accession. Its working title bespeaks the novel's origins in Waugh's trip to Abyssinia to cover the coronation of Haile Selassie in 1931, or 1930 actually. And it also, he talks about this trip in his travel book, Remote People, published in 1931, which I will speak about a few times throughout this talk. So Waugh, it seems, with his working title to primarily have meant a connotation that links to Seth's rise and fall as a monarch. The attainment or acquisition of an office or position of power. Accession comes from the Middle French for an attack of illness, paroxysm, addition, supplement, acquisition, and its Latin etymon, meaning action of coming near, approach of disease, attack, onset, etc. Waugh read Latin and not so well, but he did read French. So it's not too much to argue that he would have thought this title particularly apt, connoting not only the accession of a monarch to a throne, but also Azania's laboured accession to modernity, an accession that unwittingly joins modernity to so-called savagery, in a series of actions and machinations that are figured as frenzied, delusional and febrile. And there's lots of imagery of riot and heat and disease throughout the novel. Black Mischief, the novel's published title, has always troubled me as being a rather less effective title for doing anything other than the thing that I'm just about to talk about. It came quite late in the novel's genesis, between April and May 1932, right at the end of his writing process. So it was written up to early June. He sent the complete manuscript to his publishers in early June. It was published in October of the same year, 1932. And the title change came at the behest of his American publishers, Farrar and Reinhardt, who wrote that accession as such means practically nothing in America. It might, Black Mischief, be a literary reference deriving from Robert Armin's The History of Two Maids of Morclack, play from 1609. The line that I found is, "Rouse thee, Black Mischief, from thy ebon cell." And here, Black Mischief is a euphemism for the devil, I think. And mischief itself, the word mischief, operates in this way, as I'll come to shortly, as a euphemism for the devil. This is a reasonably obscure literary reference, I think. I mean, if there's any 17th century scholars around, I feel like it's a reasonably obscure reference. But Waugh was quite fond of early modern playwrights. He liked Webster, for example. So it's possible that he would have read it. I haven't come across his reading of it anywhere, but he was quite a haphazard diarist of his own reading. Mischief is also not a common word in the novel text. It's mentioned only twice. It's the name of a horse, and it's referred to, Basil is kind of disparaged. It's making mischief. It's not a common word. But what it does do quite well, I think, mischief, that is, which in any of its connotations, meaning misfortune, evil, harm, wrongdoing, disease, annoyance, or euphemistically, as in the Armin quotation, the devil. It links these meanings with blackness, that is, with race. The linking of mischief with harm also provides us with a nice point to reconnect with one of the questions that I asked earlier, which is, does satire hurt? Let's find out. Returning to Bergson. So in his more famous formulation, the one I quoted earlier, comedy requires a momentary anaesthesia of the heart. But this momentary anaesthesia belongs to the joke teller and the joke hearer, rather than the butt of the joke. I think the jokes are meant to hurt. I don't think that's a revolutionary position to hold. The jokes, in fact, are meant to punish. And again, this is not a revolutionary position to hold. Satire, or the satirist, is often imagined as a weapon, a blade, an axe, a knife, a bomb, some other destructive force. I like to think here of Dryden's fine executioner's stroke that, quote, separates the head from the body and leaves it standing in its place. Eric Linklater said of Waugh that he was the smiler with the knife, a description that links punishment to pleasure. The trope of the weapon shows that satire is frequently both violent and punitive. Jonathan Greenberg writes, working through Freud's arguments about tendentious jokes, that moral outrage and sadistic pleasure in satire have the same stimulus. Indeed, Greenberg argues that satire's pretensions to morality, quote, make possible its aggressive sources of pleasure, end quote. So this is an interesting counterpoint to Bergson. In place of anaesthesia, a lack of feeling, we have pleasure, an intense form of sensation. Much critical work on 20th century satire, 20th century literary satire, I should say, has tended to play down its efficacy. Brian Connery and Kurt Coombe note the new critical tendency to dismiss or resist the notion of satiric intentionality. And this is where readings like Robert C. Eliot's appear, in which satire is worthy of critical analysis only once belief in its efficacy is extinguished. In 1938, the French playwright Jean Giraudoux, in an introduction to the new French translation of Black Mischief, argued that satire is a harmless literary form, which takes its virtues and its failings seriously. I suppose that's what I'm doing, taking its virtues and its failings seriously. Daniel Buckingham, reviewing this tendency in satire criticism from the 20th century, writes, insistence upon satire's lack of efficacy is an especially troubling approach to take when we start to consider satiric bigotry, that is, bigotry expressed through the techniques of satire. To argue that satire is incapable of persuasion or that it undoes itself out through paradox is essentially to leave unaddressed the bigotries that satire is capable of propagating. To claim that satire is toothless is to claim that its bite cannot hurt. But if satire is fueled not only by sadistic pleasure, that is, pleasure in someone else's pain, but also by a punitive morality, then we have to take seriously not only its capacity, but its intention to hurt, to bite. If we consider research into the psychic and cultural impact of microaggressions, another form of verbal abuse, then satire as a literary form that regularly uses abuse and aggression should by rights have impact. Intentional harm, no matter who or what is the target, is not only a means but an end of this mode. So Bergson's other formulation about comedy, I've quoted Bergson too many times, I think, is that it's something mechanical and crusted upon the living. This is a very famous quotation. And this suggests that the distinction that comedy makes, or the scene of judgment that it presides upon, is that of what is living and what is other than living. As Lauren Ballant and Sian Nye argue, following from Simon Critchley and much earlier, the Earl of Shaftesbury, comedy, quote, helps us to test or figure out what it means to say us, end quote. Similarly, Konrad Lorenz and Alenka Zupancic both suggest that comedy sustains oppression and exclusion by drawing lines around a community and supporting the status quo. So in other words, comedy, and by extension satire, polices the boundaries of the social, offering inclusion or exclusion in a community of laughter. It follows that those who are not us are also in some way, according to this definition, not human. Mechanical, lifeless, not part of the living world we recognise as deserving of empathy. Satire, as Robert Fidian says, is an othering process. So Tanya Rodriguez argues that it is precisely anesthetic appreciation rather than aesthetic appreciation, the numbing of the heart of which Bergson speaks, that is at work with racist joking. But simultaneously, as a joke requires detachment or numbing from the speaker, it also compels intimacy. The intimacy, Rodriguez says, that is established by the joke between the teller and the hearer. She also notes, quoting from Ted Cohen's work, that offensive jokes disfigure those to whom the offence is directed. So intimacy and community are sparked and sustained by the racist joke that at the same moment excludes and disfigures. Bergson's momentary anaesthesia implies, though, I think, the return of feeling, the return indeed of pain for both the disfigured object and the telling subject. And I think this becomes interesting, especially when we read texts at a distance. Maybe talk about that later. So as a young man, Evelyn Waugh had aspirations to be a visual artist. He drew regularly for the Oxford student magazines Isis and The Broom. He illustrated several of his early novels, and he designed dust jackets for several London publishers. Rebecca Moore has written most recently and extensively about Waugh's visual art, and I want to acknowledge her really important work here. She was really the first person to do a kind of full-scale study of his visual artwork. Moore argues that, quote, Waugh's book illustrations and covers can be seen as an attempt to capture the idea of the book as an art object and to exercise complete control over it. And apologies, but also kind of not. This next section is going to contain a lot of book historical nerd stuff, so you're just going to have to bear with me as I talk about multiple editions, because that's the only thing that I care about at the moment. Okay, so Waugh originally designed 12 illustrations for Black Mischief, which appeared variously in the 3 published UK editions. So you can see here the first trade edition published in 1932, and this edition included 3 illustrations. two quarter-page devices that appeared on the dust jacket, Seth Imperator and the Imperial Crown, which appeared on the spine of the dust jacket, plus the map of the Azanian Empire, which appeared as a frontispiece. And the map reappears in most editions of this novel. Here it is. Here it's in the middle of the novel, and I think it's interesting to think about the way the map is repositioned throughout published editions of the text, but I won't talk too much about that. So this is from the parallel limited large paper first edition, which was also published in 1932 in a limited edition of 250. This included 9 illustrations. So the full set, the full set. Sorry, 9 additional illustrations. So 8 full-page line drawings, now held by the Columbia Rare Book and Manuscript Library, one additional quarter-page device for the last page of the novel, which was a little gramophone. It's very cute. These illustrations appear variously in later trade editions of the novel. So the second UK edition, which was published in 1948 as part of a uniform edition of some of Waugh's novels, includes HIM Seth of Azania. We'll look at this closely shortly. And that was included as a frontispiece, but the second UK edition doesn't include the map. The third UK edition, published in 1962 as part of a new revised edition, includes all 9 of the full-page drawings, but none of the quarter-page devices. So these illustrations, like all paratexts, mediate the text, contributing to the figuring and disfiguring of the satiric object. And here we can turn to an instructive comparison, probably much more familiar to many of you here, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. For the reader of either of these novels in unillustrated form, it's possible, although far less likely today, to read them as advancing an anti-racist or only medium racist agenda. I don't know if that's a critical term. Because of the way that the satirical writing works to ironically undermine assumptions about white or European superiority, and the way that both novels in a limited fashion work to humanise their black characters. But as Stephen Railton, the editor of the Broadview edition of Huck Finn, notes, Edward Kemble's illustrations, a key aspect of the text's packaging for its original readers, work unmistakably to render Jim, the main black character, as a minstrel stereotype. Railton writes, to Twain's contemporaries, whose readerly responses were undoubtedly being guided by the pictures that occupied so much space on the page, the caricatured role that the narrative writes for Jim is no different from the stereotyped way he appears visually throughout the story. As he is drawn, Jim never has a chance to become a human being. Waugh's illustrations, which appeared in the 4 UK editions printed in Waugh's lifetime, draw on the visual traditions of British blackface minstrelsy. Michael Pickering's monograph, Blackface Minstrelsy in Britain, traces the distinctive history of this popular form in the UK. He writes that blackface minstrelsy travelled to Britain in the 1830s, where it became a preeminent form of British popular entertainment throughout the 19th and much of the early 20th centuries, drawing audiences from across the whole social spectrum. It was not it was kind of class agnostic as a form. As Pickering argues, British blackface minstrelsy, which differed in many ways from the American tradition as it developed following the Civil War, quote, popularised and amplified the historically limited knowledge of the Negro, and in so doing helped to crystallise particular stunted characterisations and recognitions of Black people and the cultural practices associated with them. In particular, Pickering writes, the costume traditions of British blackface minstrelsy evolved a distinctive set of visual cliches that would be associated with a popular image of the Negro in Britain. For example, one particularly popular costume tradition was the dandy minstrel. And you can see an example of this in the blackface performer George Henry Eliot. In one such version, he's wearing this kind of long satin coat. He's got a top hat, he's got a little buttonhole. So let's return to Waugh's illustrations. HIM Seth by the native artist was included in 3 separate editions of the novel. So the limited first edition, UK2 and UK3. Rebecca Moore rightly notes that this portrait subtitled by the native artist, as well as its compositional elements, clearly reference this portrait. This is HIM Haile Selassie I, King of the Kings of Ethiopia, from the painting by a native artist. This appears, or bought this portrait in Abyssinia when he was travelling there as a foreign correspondent, used it as a frontispiece for remote people, and hung it in his bathroom, his toilet. So there's a self-referential joke working with the portrait in Black Mischief, in that readers who obtained a copy of the illustrated edition, and later readers in the 40s, late 40s and 60s who obtained the second and third edition would see this, that HIM Seth appears in the same textual position as the portrait of the real Abyssinian emperor in the travel book that provided Waugh with the fodder for his novel. And here it is. In the illustration for Black Mischief, though, Waugh has transformed the face of the emperor into that of the black-faced minstrel, as seen in the exaggerated features, the pop eyes and the wide clown-like mouth common in black-faced minstrelsy. Seth's mode of formal European dress, shown here and elaborated textually in the novel. He wears a top hat and pearl studs in chapter 4, he goes to a party. Also clearly draws upon the British blackface costume tradition of top hat, tails, waistcoats, and pearl buttons. Michael Pickering comments that British blackface, quote, confirmed a sense of modernising British distinction in contrast to savage backwardness in so-called undeveloped parts of the world. This happened at a time when Africa was gradually being opened up to European expansionism, and British people were confronted with a broader spectrum of cultural difference than in earlier centuries. The ideology of race was the dominant means for coming to terms with such difference. Though Waugh declared in his 1962 preface to the third UK edition that there was, quote, never the smallest resemblance between the two kings, his fictional king and Haile Selassie, in a private letter, he described his illustration of Seth as, quote, one of Haile Selassie. The intention is obviously to draw a visual parallel between the historical Haile Selassie with this race-based musical stereotype. So the same visual trope is used in this drawing, General Connolly at Ukaka, also subtitled from the native artist, or from the painting by a native artist, which again uses the exaggerated features of blackface to caricature the African characters, whether or not they are in native costume, as in the figure on the far left, or modern military dress, as in the two figures with rifles at the bottom of the drawing. Ayanna Thompson writes that claims of, quote, faithful reproduction of authentic plantation life also often accompanied 19th century minstrel representations too. As Rebecca Moore writes, Waugh uses this phrase by the native artist, quote, to distance himself from the two most offensive illustrations in the book, end quote. To distance and to authenticate the representation of the figures. Most particularly, though, what these illustrations do is to ensure that the black characters, like Twain's Jim, never become human. They remain satiric objects. So the etymology of satire, in the Latin phrase lanx satura, suggesting a mixed platter, a serving, a stuffing, or fullness and satiety, links with the overlapping alimentary tropes which cluster around Black Mischief and its reception, as well as around satire more generally. To what extent does satire violate the boundaries of moderation and good taste, and in so doing generate disgust? What are the political, ethical, and aesthetic consequences of eating one's enemies, satirically speaking? As Madeline Redden notes, both aesthetic modernism and modernity rely upon the distinction between a, quote, primitive racialised figure and a, quote, modern subject. In this sense, Waugh's novel is an exemplary work of modernist satire as well as anti-modern satire, in that his central satirical joke about Azania is that any efforts towards modernisation are doomed because its people are hopelessly primitive because they're kind of natural cannibals. This primitivism, which is primarily evidenced through their cannibalism, is also infectious. Modern European characters also succumb to their primitive appetites while they're in this country. Waugh develops this joke into a whole set of images associated with meat, eating, and digestion, in which various people literally and figuratively eat people or participate in kind of grotesque feeding. For example, in response to Seth's anxiety that the local custom of eating raw meat is not modern, Basil replies, "Call it steak tartare." An imperial banquet honouring the visit of some RSPCA ladies sees multiple courses of exotic meats served in celebration of British superiority in matters pertaining to cruelty to animals. And a back and forth power play over the issuing of boots to the barefoot Azanian army ends in the soldiers eating the boots as part of a native feast. So the boots went down all right with your men after all, Connolly. They went down. No cases of lameness yet, I hope. No cases of lameness, 1 or 2 of bellyache though. Short one. Finally, an offhand remark made in the course of a sexual encounter, quote, "You're a grand girl, Prudence, and I'd like to eat you," culminates in the eating of Prudence by Basil during Seth's funeral feast, quote, "stewed to a pulp among peppers and aromatic roots," end quote. Although cannibalism literally means incorporation of another's body into one's own, Waugh implies that throughout that Seth's efforts towards modernisation are doomed because, as in the joke about the boots, the primitive Azanians can't digest modernity. That a huge amount of the jokes about eating are made at the expense of the Azanians underlines the point made by Bell Hooks of the stereotype of Black people as more body than mind. It's like a continued thing in the novel of African characters eating. It's a very old trope. So old, indeed, that in 1928, the Brazilian surrealist Oswald de Andrade had reconstituted it in his political aesthetic Manifesto Antropofago, or Cannibalist Manifesto. In this text, Andrade satirically allies the image of the cannibal to a modernism that incorporates Western with Brazilian culture, digested and remade into new forms. He writes, "Cannibalism alone unites us socially, economically, and philosophically." His manifesto is deliberately provocative. It's a really interesting text, arguing for an embrace of the vilified, taboo, and mocked identity that has been thrown upon so-called savage societies by so-called civilized ones. In parodying and appropriating the cannibal myth, Andrade turns the savage violence at the heart of the colonial project onto itself. Similarly, the Martinican poet and writer Aimé Césaire, in his 1950 Discourse on Colonialism, casts the cannibal-colonialism relationship even more explicitly. As Césaire wrote, "Capitalism was thingification, the rendering of the human subject into matter to be exploited and consumed." And this exploitation also debases the exploiter, rendered bestial in turn. These heads of men, these collections of ears, these burned houses, these Gothic invasions, this steaming blood prove that colonisation, I repeat, dehumanises even the most civilised man. The coloniser who, in order to ease his conscience, gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, and tends objectively to transform himself into an animal. For Césaire, colonisation was cannibalism. The appetite and force of the voracious capitalist interests of the gold digger and the merchant, allied with the sadistic pleasures of anti-Black violence. In Waugh's novel, Basil Seal is a quintessential thief and opportunist of Western colonial capitalism, intent on exploiting the resources of the nation for his own benefit. And this is where I think Waugh's satire is slightly more interesting, in that it's quite clear to see the culpability and the kind of reprehensibility of Basil, as well as many of the white kind of semi-colonials. And it's also important for an anti-racist reading to emphasise that the novel uses the cannibal banquet that Basil participates in as a punchline. It only works because the Azanians confirm the worst cliches that white Western readers are expecting about African savagery. Sorry to quote you again, or maybe I'm not sorry. Robert Finian argues that perhaps the most pressing line of inquiry for critics working on satire is to understand the ways in which it mobilises public emotions, in particular the affective triad of contempt, anger and disgust. In the case of Waugh's novel, it definitely provoked censure from contemporary reviewers, but not for its racist tropes or language. Waugh had written to his friend Diana Cooper that he thought readers could enjoy the novel, quote, without any grave sacrifices of taste, end quote, but this was not to be. Rather, as Ernest Oldmeadow, the editor of the Catholic weekly The Tablet, opined in early 1933, it was the, quote, nauseating representations of adultery and cannibalism that violated Catholic civility and called into question Waugh's good faith. Waugh, who had left on a trip to British Guiana almost immediately after the publication of Black Mischief, returned to London in May 1933 to discover that a minor literary skirmish had occurred in his absence. A back and forth of editorials and letters in the Tablet disputing or supporting Waugh as a novelist and as a Catholic. It's a kind of a real faith-based argument occurring. Oldmeadow, it's kind of the end of the series. Oldmeadow argued that letters of support from prominent Catholic writers proclaiming regard for Mr. Waugh provided a, quote, coat of whitewash for Waugh. And this language, I just had to include it because I just find its unintentional irony particularly sweet. So in response to Oldmeadow's attack, Waugh composed an open letter to, it's called An Open Letter to His Eminence, the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster. So he was the Catholic Archbishop of the Diocese of Westminster and nominally Oldmeadow's boss. The Tablet was the official publication of Catholicism in England. And Waugh's satiric diatribe in this open letter, which was privately circulated, it wasn't published, bears very close resemblance to a much more famous text, Modest Proposal. Waugh wrote, the Tablet quotes the fact that she was stewed with pepper as being in some way a particularly lubricious process, but this is a peculiar prejudice of the editors, attributable perhaps, like much of his criticism, to defective digestion. It cannot matter whether she was roasted, grilled, braised or pickled, cut into sandwiches or devoured hot on toast. It's a savoury. So the sociologist Norbert Elias once claimed that, quote, he who laughs cannot bite. Simon Critchley here notes, though, that, quote, ethologists report that laughter originated in the animal function of aggressive baring of teeth. So, as Matthew Beavis infers, behind the smile may lie a socialised snarl, behind the laugh a play fight, but behind both of these facial expressions lie real snarls and real fights, and we can infer real bites. For Walter Benjamin, the satirist is, quote, the figure in whom the cannibal was received into civilization, end quote. So, as Beavis comments, the satirist is, quote, at once savage and civilised. He cuts us up after having been granted permission, perhaps even encouraged to take that liberty, end quote. And that's, I think this is clearly what's happening with Waugh, is being encouraged to turn this kind of alimentary trope and to escalate it. In Waugh's open letter, we see mutual contempt and disgust, Oldmeadow's and Waugh's turning and returning in their heightened use of the digestive trope and in tropes of taste, nausea, etc. The long list of cooking methods mentioned here means that the cannibal theme is overfull. The reader is surfeited with satire as Waugh consumes Oldmeadow's disgusted language and spews it back. Like the cannibal, the satirist consumes and incorporates the satirized human turned object through parody, imitation, burlesque, or whatever formal technique you care to name. And in the production and reception of Black Mischief, there is plentiful evidence of the ways in which satire disfigures through a process of grotesque incorporation, elimination, and rejection. Throughout this talk and elsewhere in humour theory and comic theory, comedy and satire are imagined critically as flesh eaters, consuming and appropriating literary bodies through imitation and parody. For instance, David Worcester and James Nichols both posit satire as a parasite, succouring unto other genres. The rise of the alt-right in the 21st century shows that this generic parasite becomes a means for racist infection through the comic or satiric bite. For instance, a 2017 report by Alice Marwick and Rebecca Lewis showed the radicalisation of people, of particularly young men, through irony. Similarly, Richard J. Topinka has shown how offensive jokes are used to cloak racism and white nationalism in participatory media like Reddit. As Whitney Phillips shows, trolling, one of the standard techniques of the alt-right, shares many characteristics with satire, namely the urge to punish and correct. The irony and satire of the alt-right confirms Arpad Solishai's view of comedy as a, quote, maleficent virus, transforming politics into farce and the public sphere into a place of permanent liminality. So returning to the mischief of Waugh's title, it might suggest annoyance, but it also connotes disease, disorder, and harm. For the white conservative satirist, satiric mischief becomes a means to enact symbolic violence against the other, who is excluded from the circle of laughter because, as in Bergson, as in this foundational piece of theory, the other does not count as we. I hope that in attending to this particular case, we might also be able to devise some principles to apply to a broader understanding of the politics of 20th century satire. Obviously, this is a much bigger topic than I can talk about today. I'd like to venture a very tentative final point, therefore, which is the potential for satire to expose our assumptions about the 20th century as a time in which humanist values of democracy, equality, tolerance, diversity and plurality were cherished and defended, especially by Britain against other ostensibly more nefarious cultures. While we might think of the 20th and the 21st centuries as times of increasing inclusiveness, the history of British satire during this time, as typified by Waugh, suggests otherwise.
Any questions?
Here's another picture, another racist picture for you, if you want to look at it. This is the final image from the final full-page illustration.
No hands up. Can I take a chair's privilege? The title Black Mischief goes back to Webster. Waugh was, well, a modernist anti-modern, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So, I mean, is this coming from T.S. Eliot, the interest in the Jacobeans? And
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Waugh, he definitely read Eliot. I don't know that he read any of Eliot's criticism very carefully,
right.
But I think it was, you know, the Jacobeans were in vogue in the 20s. So I think that's probably where it's coming from. It's a kind of modish interest in minor Jacobean playwrights.
Pre-modern.
Yeah.
I was just wondering the image, the reproduced image of the, I don't know, king, emperor, whatever, reminded me very much with like the dotted tie and the flower of like a modern clown. I don't know at that time if this image of a clown was already around or not, but is that something that is fancy, or it's that more modern view of that, because it looked very clown-like?
I mean, I think that they're both there. I mean, and I think that the image of the modern clown and the blackface, the racial prosthetics of blackface come from a similar place. The blackface makeup has a similar, uses the kind of similar makeup techniques to clown makeup, just with different colours. So I think that is there as well. So it's clearly meant to be being made ridiculous. And Seth is this kind of functions as this kind of serious clown figure.
Robert,
I'm interested in the use of taste as a very, as a metaphor that does a lot of work, and taste as the justification for criticising satire. And I'm wondering, you have any observations on it as a two-edged sword? On the one hand, as a way into reasonably careful interpretation, or on the other hand, as a foil, just to bat away the whole thing. Cartoons often, John.
That's in poor taste. So,
yeah.
but we'll just ignore it.
Taste is the only other reason that cartoonists get cartoons refused by editors.
Yeah.
It's just in terribly bad taste. So John only talked about the law, so he's been lucky.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess, and I haven't fully worked out. This is what I was trying to think about this, and I haven't fully worked it out. That there's something going on. I think, you know, who defines what's in good taste or bad taste is also an operation of power. So I think, you know, when a cartoon is dismissed as being in poor taste or I guess upheld as being, you know, as in what Waugh said, you know, you can enjoy it without any grave sacrifices of taste. Yeah, I think there's certain privileges and power and kind of power positions that go along with that judgment. And so I do think there's something going on with cultural capital that allows whoever is receiving the cartoon or the text to make that judgment. And yeah, I think I think that the kind of idea of taste is one that we see as being somehow less unsettling.
And is Waugh literalising the metaphor in the cannibalism?
Well, he doesn't talk
sort of
really about what prudence tastes like, remembering. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of this. I also didn't kind of get to talk about this, but there's obviously a lot of kind of misogynist, you know, stuff going on with the eating of the woman's body, and it's a kind of misogynist pleasure or sadistic pleasure in the witnessing this consumption of the white woman's body by the African characters and by Basil. In the scene, they're eating this stew, and it transpires that one of the Azanian characters has kept Prudence's distinctive hat. It's a red pillowbox red beret, and he's kept it and he's put it on his head, which is again this kind of like ridiculing moment. And Basil kind of goes, "Where is the white woman? Where is the white woman?" And yeah, her it is this kind of clear moment of racial specificity that part of the disgust is the eating of the white woman by these black characters. I don't know if that answered your question at all.
No.
Sorry.
Yeah, Jessica.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Nim. I want to ask you if you would say a little more about what you think the true target of the satire is. It's always seemed to me that what Waugh is doing is, yes, we can disapprove now, looking back, looking at some of our contemporaries, we can disapprove of the fact that he adopts, without question, all the conventional derogatory stereotypes of primitive culture ripe to be colonized of the time. But then he sends into conflict with that this appalling representative, and he makes it clear that he thinks he's an appalling representative of the, quote, superior culture, and shows that there is, that there is not much distinction between the two, and B, that Seth and his people are entirely wrong in trying to ape what is being pushed at them as appropriate forms of behaviour. So where does the balance lie?
I mean, yeah, I think I would have had a like the kind of my knee-jerk position. It's not a knee-jerk position. I've been thinking about this novel for quite a while. I mean, the satire falls unevenly. You know, so yeah, of course, all of the there are no positive models. Waugh himself says, so in the open letter to the Cardinal, he says, you know, I find myself in the unfortunate position of explaining one's own jokes, and he says, you know, the only positive character in the novel is a very minor character who's a Catholic mission father, and that this is the kind of one note of you know, a positive moral model. And yes, the white colonial characters are kind of lampooned and satirized. That they're definitely not held up to be models. Connolly, the general, is this kind of clear. He's I mean, Basil is bad, but Connolly is this absolutely horrific colonial character who he has an Azanian wife, who he has a name for her, which I'm not going to say because it's so racist, and it's just repeated again and again, and the joke is made again and again. But it's really a joke that is made at her expense. It's a joke that dehumanizes her, and I think that's the point, that the white characters, I mean, you know, maybe they're vile, but I feel like the satire really falls much more heavily in a dehumanizing way on the black characters
compared to, say, Scoop.
Yeah, well, and yeah, I mean, I guess compared to Scoop, which is a later novel that Waugh wrote, which is also set in a fictional African country, but the kind of, which is also racist, but where the clear target of the satire is journalists and how they're all liars. But here the target, I think, is more evenly between, you know, the fact that it's a conflict between civilization and barbarism. And barbarism really is the kind of negative, the void into which he doesn't want us to fall. Civilization is a really Waugh held it up in high regard, but what he meant by civilization is not what a modern reader might have thought he meant by civilization. He didn't, and he says this.
But he's not arguing for colonialism.
Oh no, I don't think he's arguing for colonialism.
I think that's a really important.
It is an important point. Yeah, he doesn't think that the colonial project is good.
No,
he thinks it's bad, but he doesn't offer any positive alternative. His solution is destruction, I think, which is a very negative solution.
Michael,
just a thought about the possibility of this being Waugh's anti-modernist novel, in a sense, in a similar way, maybe between Joyce, in between Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Ulysses, that actually modernism is the problem here. It's need,
absolutely agree.
It's need to have a curative aspect.
Yeah,
It's part of the modernist project.
Yeah,
he finds problematic.
Yeah, and I don't know how this fits in either, but look, I'll say it anyway. The connection between Abyssinia and blackface had been made in an extremely famous fashion by Virginia Woolf, who was part of this kind of hoax called the Dreadnought hoax, in which Woolf and a bunch of her friends dressed up in blackface and impersonated Abyssinian dignitaries and got onto a dreadnought, a naval ship. I don't know how to describe it. And it was like the talk of the town. Yeah, so yeah, modernism, I think in kind of seeking to have this kind of position of high cultural distinction, modernism has a lot to answer for. It's not to defend Waugh, though, I think. But I agree with you that this is an anti-modernist.